I want to welcome everyone to the LSE's online events platform. My name is Peter Trubowitz. I'm a professor in the International Relations Department and director of the U.S. Center at the LSE, which is hosting today's lecture. Today's lecture is part of the Phelan Family Lecture Series, which is made possible by the generosity of the John and Amy Phelan Foundation. And I'm delighted that John Phelan is in the audience today, joining us, alas, like all of you, from a safe and socially responsible distance. John, it's very good to have you with us today. When we scheduled today's lecture with Professor Joseph Nye, the social, political, and economic landscape in the United States looked quite different. Today, the country is in the grips of three intersecting crises: a health crisis that has killed over 100,000 Americans, an economic crisis that has thrown more than 40 million out of work, and now a social crisis triggered by the death of George Floyd in police custody. All of these crises raise vexing questions, but the massive protests and unrest in America's cities have really put questions of moral leadership front and center in American life in a way that has drawn parallels to the 1960s. It has also reminded many of us that how America conducts itself at home matters internationally. Intentionally or not, its moral conduct is always on display. Foreign policy often begins at home, and today's lecture on the role of ethics and moral reasoning in US foreign policy could not be more timely. We also could not be more fortunate to have one of America's leading thinkers and writers about foreign policy with us to help us think through these issues. Joe Nye has taught for many years at Harvard University, where he is the University Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus and the former Dean of the Kennedy School of Government. Joe was trained at Princeton, Oxford, and Harvard. He served in Washington, D.C. as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, and Deputy Undersecretary of State. He is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the British Academy, and the American Academy of Diplomacy. He's published widely over the course of a very distinguished career and is especially well known for his writings about American foreign policy and the role of power in world politics. These include some 15 books, the most recent of which is the subject of today's lecture, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. Before we begin, let me say a few words about today's format, clearly different than what we would normally be doing at the LSE. Joe is going to kick things off. We're then going to turn to questions. I've invited two very special guests to join us today to put the first questions to Joe. Mick Cox, Professor of International Relations Emeritus and co-director and founder of LSE Ideas, and Leslie Vinjamori, head of Chatham House's Americas program and an associate professor of international politics at SOAS. Mick, Leslie, great to have you here with us today. After Leslie and Mick have a friendly go at Joe, we'll then open it up for questions from all of you in the audience. You can send your questions in via the chat function, the Q&A function on Zoom. And I and the US Center team will do our level best to put as many of those questions, your questions, to Joe. Normally at this point in the opening, I would ask all of you to put your hands together to give Joe one of those very warm LSE welcomes. That, of course, is not possible today. But I know many of you have eagerly been anticipating this event. We have topped out with 1,000 people registering for it. So in lieu of applause, I encourage all of you to put questions to Joe, to pose questions in the Q&A period. Joe, with that, welcome to LSE's online platform. It's really great to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's great to be back at LSE, even if it's only virtually. I was commenting and facetiously to my wife the other day that I'd just given a speech on 4 continents and had not wasted a single liter of aviation fuel, and that maybe there was some silver lining in this current pandemic after all. But frankly, I'd much rather be at LSE physically and see so many of my old friends there. But life is what it is. Let me turn to the book that you mentioned, Do Morals Matter? And I should tell you that many people think I'm wasting my time, or did waste my time in writing such a book. The conventional wisdom in our field is that no, morals don't matter that much in international relations. And in fact, one friend, when I told her that was what I was writing about, said, well, good, at least it'll be a short book. In terms of the conventional wisdom, people generally will say things like, it's all about national interests. And I remember once when I was working in the State Department on some nuclear proliferation issues, talking to a French diplomat after a meeting, and I said, do you ever worry about or think about the moral implications of these issues? And he said, no. He said, morals don't matter. He said, the only thing I care about is the interests of France. And I don't think he realized what a profound moral judgment he had just made. But that's pretty much the conventional wisdom. I think most people would say, well, interests bake the cake, and then politicians come along and they sprinkle a little moral icing on top to make it look pretty, but it's interests that bake the cake. I think that if you have that cynical view, you're actually going to get history wrong. That there are some circumstances where the moral views of the leader, the American presidents that I look at in the period since 1945, actually determine the outcome. Or another way of putting it is that these moral views were a crucial ingredient in the cake, not just some icing sprinkled on top. So I have two purposes in the book. One is to, if you want proven existence theory, that I can show you some instances in history, particularly looking at the 14 case studies I have of American presidents since 1945. I can show you some case studies where the outcome was significantly determined by the moral views of the president. Not all cases, obviously, but if I can show you some that are important, that serves that purpose of the book. A good example of this probably would be Harry Truman and the nuclear bombing or non-bombing that occurred during his presidency. Many people have blamed Truman for his bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And indeed, a very distinguished British moral philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe, refused to attend the ceremony at Oxford where Truman was given an honorary degree in 1948 because of Truman's bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the story is more complex than that. What people don't realize is that Truman, when he participated in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was doing what General Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, which built the bomb, he was like a boy on the back of a toboggan that was already speeding downhill. Possibly he could have stopped it, but not very likely. Roosevelt had never consulted him about this, and the conventional wisdom of the government as a whole was that we would go ahead. But what people don't pay enough attention to is that there was a third bomb, which didn't get dropped. It was sitting on Tinian Island, and there would have taken about a week to have actually prepared it and dropped it. Truman said no. And he said no because in the words he used, which were morally important words, I'm not going to kill that many more women and children. So that is interesting that there were two bombs sort of pre-planned, but not a third bomb. The other thing that's interesting is in 5 years later, in the Korean War, after the Americans pushed back up to the Yalu River, China crossed the Yalu, pushed the Americans back down the peninsula, It looked like the war would be lost, or at least stalemated, and Truman was warned that that would be the end of his presidency. And General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, who was the commander-in-chief in the Far East, said to Truman, "If you allow me to drop 25 to 40 atomic bombs on Chinese cities, I'll win this war for you." And Truman said no. He said, "No, I'm not going to kill that many more people." He tried to explore options to see whether there was a way to do it. But basically, the decision he made had a good chunk of moral concern involved in it. And as Thomas Schelling, the Nobel laureate economist, once put it in his Nobel speech, the nuclear taboo, that we were treating nuclear weapons for deterrence and not for normal warfighting purposes, may be one of the most important things that's occurred internationally in the period after 1945. And that was a decision that could have gone either way. And the fact that Truman's moral views helped to push the decision toward the taboo of non-use of nuclear weapons is of tremendous importance. So the cynics who say it's all just interests that bake the cake and moral views don't matter have a hard job trying to explain away that decision. But I illustrate some others in the book as well for the other presidents. So one purpose of the book is essentially, as I said, an existence theorem to prove that if you have the cynical view that morals don't matter in international relations, you're going to get history wrong in some important cases. The second purpose of the book, though, was so what? What do we do about it? In other words, once you say that morals do matter, answering the question in the title, what about the way we should think about it? What's the right way to make judgments? And all too often, Americans turn toward something that historians have called American exceptionalism. We are a moral people. We have good motives and good intentions. When we do something, therefore, it's moral. This is very shallow reasoning. Anybody who holds that view has to explain to Mexicans and Philippines how we behaved toward them in the 19th century. And so moralism or exceptionalism is not the answer. Indeed, too much moralism in which you don't pay attention to the consequences can lead to very immoral consequences. So what I propose in the book is that instead we think in what I call a three-dimensional framework. We try to look at the dimension of intentions, means, and consequences, all three, and try to balance them out as a way to appraise the morality of a policy or an action. So, for example, when George W. Bush invaded Iraq, his press secretary, Ari Fleischer, said you had to admire Bush's morality because of its moral clarity. He was proposing a freedom agenda. He was going to save the Middle East from the terrors of Saddam Hussein with nuclear weapons, but also the scourge of terrorism by having democracy come to Iraq. I argue that that's extremely shallow moral reasoning. And I use a simple example drawn from everyday life, or could be everyday life. Imagine that your daughter was studying for exams, have had very important exams on a Saturday morning. And the Friday night, there was a dance, and she was out at the dance, and a friend of yours said, "Oh, don't worry, I'll pick her up, and I'll make sure she gets home early, so there's plenty of time for the dance." And also plenty of for your friend picks her up, doesn't notice that there's been a rainstorm, the roads are slick, and speeds at 70 or 80 miles an hour on the narrow roads, skids off the road and hits a tree, and your daughter is killed. Would you say, but his intentions were good? and therefore it was a moral action? Of course not. You'd say there was inappropriate means and inadequate attention to possible immoral unintended consequences. So the action as a whole was immoral, even though his intentions were good. I would argue that's a pretty close metaphor with what Bush did in Iraq. Let's grant, for argument's sake, that Bush did indeed care about a freedom agenda and about preventing Saddam from getting nuclear weapons. Suppose his intentions were good. Nonetheless, on the means that he used in the invasion of Iraq and the efforts to bring democracy to Iraq, there was inappropriate means. And there were a number of papers that were prepared by the State Department and by the intelligence community warning of that, but they were all discarded. They were ignored. And of course, in terms of consequences, Bush had totally disproportionate, unintended, immoral consequences. The net effect was you could get rid of Saddam Hussein, but you couldn't bring democracy to Iraq in a way that was going to prevent terrorism. In fact, what happened was Bush's invasion of Iraq actually revived al-Qaeda in Iraq, which later morphed into ISIS, the Islamic State, which of course had horrendous immoral consequences. So in that sense, if we look at Bush's morality in terms of the invasion of Iraq, his good intentions aren't enough. You also have to think of the means and the consequences. So what I try to do in the book is to lay out a framework in which you can examine all three of these dimensions. Let me say a word or two about each of them before concluding. On intentions, people sometimes look at the words that politicians use or leaders use and say, oh, you know, they're always good intentions. And that's not surprising. In a democracy, you're not going to tell people you intend to do bad things. The question is, what were the real motives that went beyond the stated intentions that drove an action? For example, if you take the case of Vietnam, the Vietnam War, John F. Kennedy put in 16,000 American advisors, but refused to let them have a combat role. And his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, later said that he thought that if Kennedy had been reelected rather than assassinated, Kennedy would have withdrawn from Vietnam in '64. And he said the reason is that Kennedy cared about being seen as smart. His motive was to be seen as smart. Lyndon Johnson, who Bundy also served, basically escalated to a situation where you had nearly 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam and in a full combat role, and turned out to be a disaster. And Bundy's argument is the reason for why Johnson acted so differently from Kennedy was that Johnson feared above all being seen as a coward. His Texas background, the tension between his school teacher mother and his macho Texas politician father, meant that Johnson couldn't, even though he realized that the war was a losing proposition, he couldn't bring himself to be seen as the man who lost Vietnam. And the net effect of that was that the emotional intelligence of Kennedy versus Johnson led to very different outcomes in terms of the actual intentions that were brought to bear on the case. One man wanting to be seen as smart, the other one wanting to avoid being seen as a coward. So intentions matter, but we have to be careful in intention when we judge intentions to go beyond the surface impression of just nice words. To go to means, there are at least two traditions by which we can judge the appropriate means or the morality of means in international relations. One is the long tradition of just war theory, going back all the way to Augustine, which becomes secularized in international humanitarian law, and indeed is built into the American Uniform Code of Military Justice. And that says you have to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants and avoid damage to non-combatants, and you have to use proportionality. So, for example, if you locate a terrorist in a building that has 100 families in it, and the terrorist is in the basement, but you know that if you drop a big enough bomb, you can actually kill the terrorist in the basement, but at the price of killing the 100 families, no, that's immoral. That's not proportional. So that tradition of proportional and discriminate means, which comes down through just war theory, is one of the criteria we look at when we judge the morality of means. That goes back to, say, Michael Walzer and his works on just war theory. But there's another dimension that can be added, and that's the liberal dimension, which traces itself back to John Stuart Mill and British liberalism of the 19th century, but in the 20th century was given its most articulate expression by the philosopher John Rawls, in which he said you can't have pure liberalism in international relations, but you can have some respect for the autonomy and sovereignty and institutions and rights of other people. And Rawls then adds some criteria by which you can achieve that. So what I do when I look at means is say, yes, look at just war theory for the use of force, think about rights and institutions. Finally, when we look at the third dimension, consequences, we have to face the fact that there are always unintended consequences in complex social actions. And that foreign policy is doubly complex because you have not just domestic considerations, but international considerations and differences of culture and power to include as well. So they're bound to be unintended consequences. And at some point, those unintended consequences can have immoral effects. However, the key question is whether you paid sufficient attention to anticipating the unintended consequences, what lawyers call, did you do due diligence? And in that sense, your argument has to be that, yes, there are going to be consequences, both good and bad, and I can't fully predict all of them. But if I've done an adequate job of due diligence, then that should suffice. Arnold Wolfers, the famous Swiss-American realist politician after World War II, one of my favorite realists, said, when we judge morality in foreign policy, we ask whether the leader did the best that the circumstances would allow. And that's not a bad way to start thinking about it, but it's a bit elastic. You can squeeze an awful lot in there. So what I try to do is create some scorecards which would allow you to look in a more refined way at each of those three dimensions. And the circumstances make a big difference. They'll vary. For example, some people will say international relations has no sovereign state, no larger government, therefore it's anarchic, everyone has to defend themselves, therefore those circumstances mean that it's a survival of the fittest, pure Hobbesian world. And there are some times when that's the case. When Winston Churchill was faced with the fact after Hitler had taken over Vichy France, that the loss of the French fleet and its addition to German naval power might prevent the Royal Navy from protecting the British Islands, Churchill actually bombed his French ally and killed 1,300 French sailors. And his argument was this was essential for the survival of the British people for whom I was the trustee. A horrible act, but understandable in the circumstances, as Wolfers put it. But there's a big difference between taking extreme cases like that and saying that's what all of international politics is about. It's not. Most of international politics is not about survival. It's about rights, institutions, welfare, assistance, and so forth. So that when Donald Trump really in the consulate of the Saudi embassy, a consul of the Saudi Arabia in Istanbul, when Trump said, "Well, it's a rough world out there, get over it." Even the conservative Wall Street Journal criticized him for not expressing American values. Trump mentioned the fact that we had interests in oil, in arms sales, and stability in the region. True, nobody says you would have bombed Saudi Arabia or broken off diplomatic relations. But you could have made a statement, you could have recalled the ambassador, you could have cut back on some of the weapons that were being sent for the war in Yemen. There are a lot of things which were possible to do short of breaking relations. In that sense, what Trump was doing was treating the murder of Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate like Churchill's circumstances of dealing with the defection of the French fleet to Germany in 1940. And once you start treating everything the same, you lose the prospect for moral action. So for people who are realists, I say, look, I'm a realist too, but I believe you start with realism. You don't stop there. In other words, what you do is you first have to think of what is necessary for survival of my people under the circumstances. After all, leaders are trustees for their people. But just because you start there doesn't mean you stop there. You have to then go on and say, can I also consider human rights? Can I consider other interests that and values? And that, I think, is where I part company. I say, start with realism, but you can add other things. And it's when you add the other things that you can begin to see some circumstances which will allow morality to play a role in foreign policy. So to summarize that, let me say that when I looked at the 14 presidents, I developed scorecards along these three dimensions. And of the 14 presidents, I came out ranking Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, in the top quartile. I ranked Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump, pending some change before the end of his term, but on the record so far, in the bottom quartile. And the rest were spread out in between with merits and demerits on various aspects of the scorecard. But what I say in the book is that the actions or the judgments that I come to are really not that important. I want people to make their own judgments. What I want them to do, though, is to think in three dimensions, to think carefully as they make these judgments. As I say in the book, I may be biased in my judgments. I may reserve the right to change my judgments in the future as I encounter new information. So I'm much less concerned that people agree with me on how I rank any particular president than that as they think about morality in international politics, A, they first accept that in some cases it can make a big difference, and B, when they try to say how they're judging whether it made a difference or not, think carefully in three dimensions and don't just retreat into exceptionalism or good intentions or simple consequentialism in which you say it works, therefore it was good. All those are logical non sequiturs. And so the book is an appeal for an improvement in our moral reasoning. I would add, I think we actually need some of that today. Anyway, that's the reason for the book, what I tried to accomplish, and I look forward to the Q&A because that's the more interesting part of the morning for me.
That's great. Joe, thank you very much. That was a terrific kind of overview, summary of the book. And I think most people that read the book know that the point is not so much how you score people, but in the book, as you state clearly, that's not what matters. It's going through the process, the reasoning that really matters the most. I have a question, but I'm going to discipline myself. I have 24 hands already raised. So they're coming in fast and 25, fast and furiously. But I want to go to both Leslie and Mick first. And Leslie, why don't I start with you and let you put the first question to Joe. I'll let Joe respond, and then we'll turn to Mick and do the same thing, and then we will open up the platform. I already have questions lined up here from students. So Leslie, I was going to say the floor, but the platform is yours.
I should say, first of all, thank you. It's an honor to be speaking with you. I'm very glad you wrote the book. I'm very glad that you didn't stop with the conventional wisdom or stop with realism, as important as I agree with you that framework certainly is. I guess I sort of want to ask you your reflections a little bit more on the question of means. And that is in part, I guess, because I've spent a lot of time at Peter's favorite institution, the LSE, and I'm reminded of many of the conversations over the years that have called America out for not thinking carefully in this category of means, about international means, about the UN Security Council, about collective authority for sanctioning the use of force. And I'm curious, when you think about means, what that means to you. And I guess it raises a broader question, of course, of the standards that are attached to confirming what's considered to be moral reasoning, a moral action in foreign policy, have changed a lot over the course of the presidents that you've looked at. So how does that affect your work? And of course, I'm also reminded of something that Adam Roberts said when he visited Georgetown in 2003, and he spoke about Iraq, and he said, in the long run, regardless of the fact that action was not authorized by that second UN Security Council resolution, that was lacking, if it turns out well, people will, assess it very differently than if it turns out poorly. So do you think consequences matter differently for how most people look at foreign policy, set aside the realist, right? Think about the public, than perhaps what you're suggesting? And secondly, you're very silent, and fair enough. It's only one book, you've written many. But you're very silent about the domestic side of foreign policy. And I know that this is something that we all cite you for, soft power and many other things. But what happens? How does that factor? Does it matter? The soft side, what people look, when they look back at America, they talk about America's hypocrisy. You can do as much good as you want in the world. You can hit all the measures of Professor Nye's assessment of moral action. But if what you're doing at home doesn't mirror your goodness abroad, it basically undercuts your action.
Well, those are great questions, Leslie, and I can almost write another book answering them. Consequences and means interact. Indeed, all three dimensions interact. That's why giving a balanced judgment is not as easy as it first looks. Sometimes when things turn out well, as Adam Roberts said, people will say, well, it turned out well, therefore it's okay. But not necessarily. You can still feel that something was wrong. And people often do express that. But it is true, there is an interaction between the two. For example, Richard Nixon carried out the Vietnam War, even though he knew it was a losing proposition, because he wanted to have the consequence of what he called a decent interval. The decent interval was the time between when he basically left Saigon and before the Hanoi took over. And that was for the credibility of the United States. As it turned out, the decent interval amounted to about 2 years. And for that, he killed or sacrificed 22,000 American troops and countless Vietnamese lives. So you could say the consequences are that he got out of Vietnam, but the means were a prolonging of a deal. And you can ask yourself the question, is it really worth 22,000 lives, not to mention the Vietnamese lives, to buy 2 years, when in fact the net outcome in Vietnam was Vietnam has more or less been able to reconcile with the US. Why did we have to kill that many people, use those means for the outcome where today Vietnamese invite the American Navy to use Vietnamese harbors? I think that's an illustration of the interaction between means and consequences. There are some people I respect who think that that Nixon's actions were appropriate. I don't. But it is an illustration of the point you're making, that there is a constant interplay between means and consequences, and that is often carried out not just among theorists, but in domestic politics as well. And the domestic politics brings up the point that you make about soft power. If you look at the ability to affect others to get what you want, which is what I call soft power, the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment, how you behave at home as well as abroad is tremendously important. Nothing dissolves soft power more than hypocrisy. And when you're seen as hypocritical, you're basically throwing away an important dimension of your power, an important aspect of soft power. That's one of the reasons why even the Wall Street Journal criticized Trump's response on Khashoggi. It would have been quite possible to have said this is an outrageous, immoral act and we condemn it, even if it didn't lead to breaking relations. But as for domestic politics, what we're seeing in the last 3 years since Trump came into office is a great diminution in American soft power as measured by public opinion polls like Pew Charitable Trust or Gallup or so forth. And that basically is a clear illustration of where hypocrisy at home or a praise America first narrowly interpreted becomes a cost to our power internationally. And certainly if you look at the recent events in the aftermath of the rioting and protests that followed the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, you can see that it's having a very negative effect on American soft power. Similarly, the ineptitude in which the Trump administration has handled the pandemic crisis has damaged American soft power. So I think it's very clear that what's going on domestically and domestic politics can have a major effect on your soft power. One thing to remember on this, though, is that soft power comes not just from the actions of the government, but it also comes from the civil society. And that means that there's potential to recover soft power. For example, in the early 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, the United States was wildly unpopular around the world because of the government policies in Vietnam. But even more interestingly, when protesters were marching in the streets around the world, they were singing Martin Luther King's "We Shall Overcome," not the Communist Internationale. So no, there's an aspect of American civil society, the ability to protest, actually helped to restore American soft power, even when the government was taking actions which were tending to undercut it. But anyway, that's it. There's a whole book to be written there. But in good questions.
Very good. Let's go to Mick.
Yeah. Hi there, Joe. Very nice to see you again virtually. I was going to give, in a sense, play the realist. Maybe Peter will want to do that later on. I want to suggest possibly that realism itself could be seen as a kind of morality, having a moralism, a moral base. I think you may or may not disagree with that, but I mean, realists like Hans J. Morgenthau, whom I think both you and I would have a great admiration for, you know, his books are full of notions of morality and what moral is, and that what realists essentially are saying is don't use force indiscriminately. Beware the overuse of intervention. Recognize limitations. Do no harm, non-intervention. And that in the end, it's better to have peace rather than war. And that's a kind of morality, is it not? I think, you know, realists can sometimes get a bad rap on this one, I think, sometimes. And you remember the debate on the Iraq War, which you mentioned earlier on in 2001, 2, and 3. I remember a very large number of realists at the time, including our old combat IR friend John Mearsheimer, leading the charge, attacking the Iraq War on realist grounds, but which I thought in the end really had quite a strong moral component core. So that's my kind of broad question. As a supplementary to that, totally different, I'm beginning to wonder, Joe, going through the current crisis that my country is going through, and yours is quite clearly in the world, I'm beginning to wonder whether competence isn't more important than morality. Because I'm getting the feedback from so many people, I'd really much prefer to have competent governments rather than ones that we've actually got at the moment. Anyway, Joe, again, thank you very much. Good to see you in such good show.
Mick, it's great to see you, an old friend. I actually agree with you. One of the things that has beset the study of international relations is this pigeonholing, or putting everybody in either a realist or a liberal or a constructivist or cosmopolitan whole, and then thinking that answers anything. The real world, all of those theories have something to contribute. With different proportions in different circumstances. You know, in that sense, I agree with you. There's no contradiction between realism and morality. And what I say in this book is that basically start with realism, but don't end there. My concern or complaint with many of my realist colleagues or friends is that they think that having made a point about international anarchy, that answers everything. And it doesn't. It starts the conversation. But if you don't start with realism, and you just start with idealism, you're going to wind up with the proverbial road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that's not enough. So I call myself a liberal realist. And my major message is don't stop with realism, but certainly start there. So you and I are in agreement on that. On the question of competence, I think that's also we're in agreement that gross incompetence can lead to highly immoral consequences. Not only does it have the real power consequences that Leslie mentioned, that if you're grossly incompetent, it's going to reduce your reputation, which reduces your soft power. But it also can lead to immoral aspects. Go back to my little example about the road accident. The incompetence of the driver and failure to appraise the slippery conditions and adjust speed to the conditions, that incompetence led to highly immoral consequences. So I agree, and I think that we're in agreement on both those points, but very often they're not expressed that as clearly as you made it in some of the debates.
Okay, that's wonderful. I'm going to try to open it up here. Joe, you know, we've got a lot of folks watching here, obviously in the UK and in the United States, but we have people watching from Norway, Portugal, Nigeria, Iran, Hong Kong, Colombia, Palestine, Finland, Ecuador, and India. I'm sure there are probably others coming online. So, you know, I think there's a great appetite and thirst for thought, for thinking on this particular topic on moral leadership and particularly its connection to the United States. I want to take two of the questions right away. We're already up to 40 questions here. I'm going to start with Teresa from Hong Kong. She's an LSE BSc student in international relations. Her question is, how would you, Professor Nye, evaluate the role of ethics in America's relationship with China in recent years, e.g. Hong Kong trade war? And then taking on a different tact, Andrew Berry, who's a student at American Military University, has this interesting question: are the impacts of moral judgments unique to superpowers, or are smaller nations similarly affected by moral qualifiers in diplomatic and foreign policy decisions?
Well, I think the questions are both interesting. The last chapter of my book actually is devoted to what I say are going to be the big moral questions of this century. And one of them is how the United States manages its relationship with China. What worries me is that the Americans tend to categorize either or. It's either a new Cold War or it's a warm friendship. And the reality is strategic competition at the same time that we can have cooperation. And for example, if you ask, should the Americans agree on China's position on the South China Sea? No, basically the Chinese position is contrary to laws declared by the International Tribunal at The Hague. And there's good reason to send freedom of navigation naval operations through the claimed waters of these artificial islands. That's strategic competition or rivalry. At the same time, if you ask, should we be cooperating with China in the World Health Organization to deal with this pandemic and future pandemics, the obvious answer is yes. Or look at climate change, where the US and China combined produce 40% of global greenhouse gases. Neither of us can solve that problem acting alone. It has to be done acting together. And by 2015, Obama and Xi Jinping had worked out a common position, which was expressed in the Paris Climate Accord, which Trump then withdrew from. So those are examples of how you can have competition and cooperation at the same time. And I think a moral policy has to do that. And the people say, yes, but does that cooperation on these global or transnational issues mean that you have to do nothing about human rights? Absolutely not. We can still object to the changes that China is making in the status of Hong Kong or the way China treats citizens in Xinjiang while cooperating on something like pandemics or climate change. So a moral activity or moral policy in the future is going to require a president who can explain that to the people. Unfortunately, we're now in a situation where it's either or. China is either the enemy across the board or it's a trade partner. And the answer, it's going to be both. As for the question about small powers and superpowers, I think these criteria, my three-dimensional criteria for morality, judging morality, can be applied to any size state. But it's also worth noticing that the circumstances, going back to Arnold Wolfer's phrase, of a small state in a precarious position are different from a superpower. Stanley Hoffman, my former colleague at Harvard, used to say that the Americans and the French were the two countries which expressed moralism most overtly in their foreign policy. The French couldn't get away with it as easily as the Americans. They were stuck on the European continent with large threatening neighbors. So the Americans, with just Canadians and Mexicans and two oceans, could be as moralistic as they wanted. So yes, your power position allows you to indulge your morality somewhat differently, but you can still have small states which, within the circumstances they face, can have a three-dimensional moral policy. And since rarely is it a matter of survival, in international politics. The room for morality is larger than people realize for both large and small states.
So we've got another couple questions here. We have a question from Heidi Zamzow, who's a PhD student here at the LSE, apparently zooming in from, I don't know, somewhere on the West Coast in the United States. And so her question is, since morals are culturally embedded, how do leaders reconcile cultural differences when crafting foreign policy, taking actions? Or put a different way, do you believe that there are universal morals that transcend cultural differences? And I think that's probably the deeper point there. And maybe while you think about that, there's a question here from Emil Kunning, who is a student at the Institute of the Americas here at UCL in town. Has the advancement of technology in warfare, i.e. drones, changed the way in which presidents and their cabinet make decisions in foreign policy? And does this have implications for morally grounded decision-making? So one question about moral relativism or universal values and morals and ethics, and another about, I think maybe kind of even more generally, I know that you picked this up in the tail end of the book, on the impact of technology on all of this.
Again, a pair of very nice and interesting questions. Obviously, morality is affected by culture. Evolutionary biologists point out that there is a moral impulse in our species, and that ability to concern ourselves for others and work with others is one of the reasons why we can build bridges and send people to the moon and giraffes or wolves can't. So it's an important part of our evolution. But as Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, has pointed out, it's expressed very differently in different cultures. So even if a moral impulse is universal, it comes out differently in different cultures. And that means that we should not expect to see our own culture as the only source of morality. But that's where I turn to in the book to John Rawls. And what Rawls said is, don't worry, don't try to have one single liberal culture. It's not possible, but you can have a sort of decent respect for the opinions of others. And if they're not too egregious in the way they're treating what they see as rights and duties of their citizens, you can treat them well. So he called this the law of peoples. And I think there's something in that Rawls's adaptation of his liberalism to the international level being not quite as strict or stringent as when he applies it domestically. And are there any expressions of this international? Yes. International humanitarian law, the so-called Geneva Conventions, are indeed binding on all states. And it's also interesting to notice that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 was not just an American imposition, it actually had much broader international support than that. And it's applied and interpreted differently by different countries, but there still are some basic grounds there to find common cause. So if you accept that view of people like Haidt and Rawls, that there is universal morality, but it's going to come out in different ways, then we wind up thinking of ways to apply our own culture that's not too imperialistic or overbearing. As for the issue of technology, there is a section at the end of the book in which I talk about the way technology is making some moral decisions more difficult. And we saw this a lot in the Obama administration, where Obama had set up particular procedures to make sure that certain decisions, when drones were used, were not taken automatically. Some could be taken not fully automatically, but without presidential approval. Others, though, required a central approval. So Obama was very concerned about making sure that both not just drone technology, but also cyber technology, that certain things required a presidential approval or a White House approval, others did not. This is going to increase. We're going to have more and more problems with this as we look at the role of artificial intelligence and the issues of how you can make deep fakes and when you interfere and don't interfere with these processes. So it's going to be a topic. If you want to write a thesis or an academic paper, this is a growth topic.
I think if questions are a sign of appreciation, I mean, the thing is, the register is just going up and up here. We're well over 50 questions right now. I've got two very different questions. One coming from a fellow named Glenn Smith, who's part of the U.S. Southern Command. And the question is, how much has the morality of secretaries of state impacted U.S. foreign policy since 1945? And so I think, maybe kind of more generally on this question, when we set aside maybe, let's say, a transformational leader like a Nelson Mandela, I mean, most leaders, who they have around them matters a whole lot in shaping both kind of the choice set that they have, that they're dealing with on a regular basis, and so I think this is an interesting question on a different angle, and this brings us back to, I think, the question also that Leslie posed. This comes from Clara McClendon, who's an LSE alum. Looks like she was a double major in media and communications and in development. She's wondering if you can apply your framework, your moral reasoning framework, to help us understand the current uprising sparked by the death of George Floyd, and the local and national government involvement in this widespread event, including means for legitimizing force and violence, and of course the paradox of our actions at home while we criticize foreign enemies for employing similar tactics. Well, so that's a very kind of broad question, but I'm wondering if, just to follow up with her line of questioning, and if you can spend a little bit of time in helping us think through what the implications of this are and the way that the American government has dealt with it, both at the national level and I think at the state and local levels.
Well, again, good questions. Secretaries of state can make a big difference. My book focuses on presidents because it's a short book and I wanted to simplify the task. But secretaries of state are mentioned and their role mentioned. If you look back to Harry Truman, it's interesting that George Marshall and Dean Acheson were both very important in shaping the early decisions, such as the Marshall Plan or the way in which the Truman Doctrine was explained. And if you look at somebody like in the Reagan administration, if you look at the different advice that George Shultz gave the president, as opposed to Caspar Weinberger, the defense secretary, you can see that the Secretary of State made a big difference. Indeed, at one point, Weinberger tried to have Shultz fired, and Reagan backed Shultz. Shultz believed that you could work with the Soviets, and he drew the analogy that foreign policy was like cultivating a garden. You planted, you weeded, you hoed, but you played it for the long run and institutional terms. And that approach actually was what Reagan picked up in his second term. So secretaries of state matter. I just speaking personally, I worked for Cyrus Vance in the Carter administration. And there were many times when a decision would come in, which I would sit there, and it was a question of how you traded off your security interests versus human rights. And Vance very often said, no, we've got to take human rights more seriously. If you had a different Secretary of State, that might have come out differently. So Secretaries of State matter. On the question of framework and applying to the current situation, I think when people talk about institutional racism, there's a lot of truth in that. Let's go back to the origins of the United States. The American founding fathers, and they were fathers at that time, were steeped in European liberalism, but they also agreed to some compromises which were totally inconsistent with that liberalism. So Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal, and went on holding slaves. And the US Constitution, to get a compromise that allowed the Southern and Northern colonies to unite into one union, wrote slavery into the Constitution. It took a civil war 100 years later to begin that process of breaking it. And then it took another 100 years after the Civil War until you began to get protests which broke the pattern of Jim Crow and segregation. And essentially, what you're seeing today, I think, is a continuation of that same tradition, which is some institutional racism still exists, despite the fact that we've elected a African-American president. But if you're a normal, everyday person walking on the streets, your fear of the police is going to be different if you're Black than if you're white. And people are at the George Floyd's murder essentially has dramatized that. If you take a long enough picture, you can say, well, based on an original sin, the Americans are making a degree of progress rather slowly and imperfectly, and that civil protest has been part of the progress that's being made. It'll be interesting to see whether that continues here. So again, if you think of does this fit? Yes, if you look at intentions of the leaders, and if you look at the consequences over the long run, they matter. The question that becomes difficult is in the means, what role does violence play? Most of the protesters say peaceful protest is important. There are some who take it a step further and engage in violence. I think over the long term, what we learned from '68 and Martin Luther King is that there's more to be gained from nonviolence in a democratic society than from violence. But we're going through a very fraught period now, and you have to take a pretty long perspective to have hope that that this current set of protests will lead to reforms which will continue to diminish the institutional racism that goes back to the origins.
Thanks. I kind of picking up on the current situation. I personally have been very struck in the past couple of days by the truly extraordinary statements issued by General James Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense under Trump, and Admiral Mike Mullen, the former chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Both have very forcefully condemned the president's responses to the protest over the death of George Floyd. And we have a question here from Patrick Jarvis, who's an LSE alum in international relations. He wants to know, what do you make of the public split between the commander-in-chief and the top military leadership? And how effectively do you think the Joint Chiefs will be able to maintain this stance? And I might just add here, I mean, yesterday Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, issued a memo to the military brass reminding them of their constitutional responsibilities, which is, and then, Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, has said he's opposed to deploying troops. So when I said there were 3 crises, I mean, something is emerging in terms of civilian-military relations that is unusual and quite exceptional, I think. And I'm, so just to pick up on Patrick Jarvis's good question, it would be great to hear your thoughts on that. And then let me go to a question from one of our students. His name is Tim. He's from Taiwan. And he asked this, also, I think just a very important question right now. Trump's foreign policy often runs against those of his allies. I think he means America's allies here, creating rifts on issues such as the environment and international organizations. What happens when the moral reasonings of traditional Western allies differ? In what ways is that significant? What are the short, near, long-term implications of that? So that's a lot.
Well, I think the question about the military and civilian leadership is quite interesting. If you look at what I call institutional racism, yes, there is institutional racism in the US, but one of the institutions which has done the most to overcome it is the military. One of the things that struck me when I served in the Pentagon was that this was a place where race really didn't play a significant daily role. There were, and the fact that military leaders will take the positions they have illustrates that their oath is to the Constitution, which, as they say, guarantees the rights of peaceful protest to all citizens. Their oath is not just to the president. It's also interesting that, I mean, Donald Trump basically sees this as a replay of 1968, in which Richard Nixon used the law and order appeal to get reelected or get elected. And Trump's going to use it to try to get reelected. So Trump is using his racist dog whistles as well as an open appeal to law and order to try to put together a coalition for his reelection. And when he had his photo op in Lafayette Square holding the Bible in front of a church, that was basically, you might call it something that's descended from reality TV. After all, Trump never served in the military. And while he likes to talk about the military, he doesn't really understand the military. There's a big gap between the attitudes of the American military and the attitudes of the top civilian politician. And if, they have to salute when ordered directly, but they also have the capacity to resign if they're ordered to do something which they think violates their oath to the Constitution. So I think it's a very interesting period. I would argue that, again, going back to this question of institutions and racism, the fact that the military has done a pretty good job of overcoming institutional racism is one of those aspects of where you can have some hope for the future. But as you said, the game is still in play. As for allies and when they disagree, this is a very interesting question because Trump has taken the position, and has been echoed by Secretary of State Pompeo, that alliances and multilateral institutions are not in our interest, that it makes us restrain ourselves. And if we are like Gulliver, the most powerful creature in this little planet, if we just throw our own weight around, we'll get more of what we want. And you shouldn't let Lilliputians tie you down with alliances and gossamer strings. Indeed, Pompeo has said some of this quite openly. But the problem with that is, and they complain about, other countries are free riders. Allies are getting a free ride and putting the burden all on us. What they forget is when the others are a free rider, we're still left driving the bus. And in that sense, this narrow transactionalism of how much did we get on any particular deal is a very myopic way of defining the national interest. Trump's phrase, America first, is not necessarily extraordinary. I mean, I'm sure Macron must say France first. But the question is not, is it America first? It's how do you define your national interest, broadly or narrowly? And the narrow transactionalism, which doesn't include the interests of allies or think in terms of multilateral institutions, basically weakens us over the long run. That's why George Shultz's metaphor of thinking of foreign policy as a garden, a long run project, is much better than thinking of it as a real estate bazaar. So I think what this approach toward allies that we've seen is that it reduces American power.
Right. I think maybe this is implied in the question, the answer that you just gave, but it might be helpful to flesh this part of it out. Mariana Rosales has put a question to us. She's at the Embassy of Costa Rica, so in Washington, D.C. He asks about using morality as a tool to justify trade policy. And here she's saying, for example, Buy American versus strengthening the international trade system or international supply chains. And, I think this is a useful question because so much of what we think about when we talk about these questions of morality, it's really, it's maybe naturally it's focused on questions about the use of force, kinetic force. And so I think she's kind of pushing us in a different direction here. And I'd be interested in, and I think many other people would be interested, especially given the direction that the Trump administration has gone, to hearing your thoughts on that. And then a question that comes from, boy, his name is harder to pronounce than mine, Dror Uralivker, who's an LSE alum from Washington, based in Washington, D.C., but is now teaching at Eton College here in the UK. Whether it's in 2021 or 2025, you know where this question's going, Donald Trump will leave office one day. Do you think his morals and decisions will have a lasting impact on American foreign policy and moral leadership? And I think maybe there was a second question, but I will leave it there. And I think this is I think the larger question here, or the question that it dovetails with something that I have been thinking about myself. A lot of people think that when you get one administration replaces another, that you can easily change course. And I think the question here is whether there's let's say a Biden administration comes in, whether there's some kind of snapback to the other position, or whether there's some kind of path dependency that the United States is on here. And so that it's, in a sense, larger than Donald Trump, where the US is. And so two different questions for you.
On the question of morality and trade, that's very interesting, because the classical liberal position is that trade is a positive sum game from which all can gain. And there's a lot in that. I mean, if you think of comparative advantage and you go back to, Cobden and Bright and Mill and so forth, this is a long tradition. But it's also true that even when everybody can gain, not all gain equally. So even if you find a situation where increasing trade makes the country richer, it may make some people in the country poorer. And that's been one of the problems with rapid globalization, economic globalization, which has been advanced by technological changes, which have led to supply chains that are very transnational. Modern communications and transportation has made possible things which lead to broad changes in patterns of income inequality inside countries, even as they may be better for the country as a whole. So you could argue that the morality of trade depends on the level of the analysis that you're taking, and that the elites who paid, who basically looked at the national level, didn't pay enough attention to the inequalities at local levels. The fellow in Ohio whose factory has been transported to Asia and lost his job and there's no replacement for it, sees the world of trade differently than the person who is doing trade statistics in Washington, D.C. So in that sense, I think Trump was able to pick up on the populism that arose from the inequalities that globalization created. And what we're seeing now is probably a degree of decoupling of supply chains, a reduction of some degree of economic globalization, but it won't be complete. And the interesting questions will be how it's going to be managed so that it doesn't get out of hand. A moral foreign policy will have to ask not just how do we preserve a positive sum game for everybody, but how do we make sure that those who are suffering from the positive sum game that benefits everybody are compensated by those who gain. And that, I think, means that there's a close relationship between certain domestic policies related to income inequality and the overall position, international morality. So a good question, and there's been a lot written. My colleague Danny Roderick and others have worked on this, on whether Trump will have a lasting impact. I think part of the degree of his impact will depend upon whether he's reelected or not. As one of my European friends put it, you can hold your breath for 4 years. It's hard to hold your breath for 8 years. There has been clearly damage to the structure of American alliances, damage to international institutions. Certain places there will be snapback. For example, on the Paris Climate Accords, Biden, if he's elected, or any Democrat would rejoin the Paris Climate Accord on day one of his administration. On the other hand, trying to rescue the Iran nuclear agreement may be more complex, but I think a Democrat would try to put that back on the track it was on before. But there'll be other cases where there's been a creation of a sense of mistrust. If the Americans are a people who can elect somebody as capricious and self-centered as Trump, yes, we might be happy with Biden for a while, but how do we know whether he won't be replaced by Trump Jr. or whatever? And so in that sense, I think there is some damage. Some recent polls taken in Germany, for example, show changes in attitudes toward the U.S. among some younger Germans. If that goes on for 8 years, it's going to have a bigger effect than if it's 4 years. 4 years, if it's 2021, there'll be a certain amount of snapback, but it's going to have to accommodate the fact that a good deal of damage has been done. 8 years, it'll be much harder.
So we have our audience base is, we've got people from all over. People have joined us from Turkey, Italy, Canada, Mexico, Israel, Pakistan, Indonesia, Brazil. So I guess the word is getting out and it's spreading, Joe. So look, I have a question for you. I'm going to ask you to put a different hat on, your deanly hat, I was struck by a comment that you made very early in the book, where you say investing in the role of moral values in the conduct of nation is not, in quotes, a career enhancing topic for a young scholar. And we have a lot of budding academics that are, kind of on the platform today, I think. And this is undoubtedly true. But as you effectively show in the book, it seems to me that's unfortunate, because moral values do play a role in foreign policy. And while one can quibble with the grade that you give for one president or another, you pretty persuasively show that the quality of a leader's moral judgment, it matters. And so what can great institutions like Harvard, like the LSE, do to basically change or modify the incentive structure to make the study of moral reasoning and ethics in international affairs, I don't know, more of a career enhancing, if you will, area of research for young scholars, to encourage more people basically to go down the path that you've just gone down? I'll leave it.
Well, I think this may be cyclical, and the cycle may be starting to turn. Americans tended to be pretty moralistic about foreign policy in the early part of the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson was an expression of this. And then the reaction against Wilson and the isolation of the 30s led to the view that America had gotten itself into such trouble by being overly moralistic. So the period of the 50s, 60s, 70s, so forth, was the period dominated by the thought of Kennan and Morgenthau and others. It's always intrigued me that Kennan, near the end of his life, came to the conclusion that he had misjudged Wilson, that he ranked him higher than he originally had. He'd been quite duper about Wilson and Wilson's moralism in the early stages. So I think the cycle may be turning, but certainly in graduate school and in the profession for a long time, the view was that the problem with American approaches to foreign policy was too much moralism. Mick edited a very good book on this that pointed this out. I think the question is, can we get back to a more balanced view, whereas you keep realism and you keep a strategic sense, but you don't take the position that it excludes all moralism, and that liberalism and realism can complement each other, not necessarily have to be either or. And so that's what I'm trying to do in the book. I taught as for the Kennedy School, I taught a course on ethics and foreign policy. In fact, the book is a reflection of basically a half a dozen years of teaching that course, because I wanted these young people who were going to go into government positions to realize that it's not either or. You can have both. You can be a realist and a liberal and have a strategic sense all at the same time. So I think LSE is well positioned to do this, and I hope the Kennedy School is as well.
Yeah, so integrating it into the curriculum through courses is clearly a way to be doing this. And I think it looks like we have time for maybe one more question here. So there's an interesting question that has come in that in some ways goes back to one of the points that Mick raised early on about competency. The question is from Shima. How do you interpret the divergent views between China and the Western world, the EU and the US, in terms of norms and universal values. And the question here is the moral that you mention in your book a concept based on a Western value system? And I think what one might maybe add to this is there are a lot of people who point to the so-called Beijing model as, one that prides, and I don't think this is what Mick was referring to, but it puts a heavy emphasis on competency and juxtaposes it, to the American, the Washington model, and so forth. So that is, and then we have one other question, and and then I'll give you the last couple of minutes. Question is from Justin Webb, who's an LSE alum. And Justin, I know who you are, also a BBC broadcaster. And it says, let's say there's a vaccine or vaccines developed in the next year for the novel coronavirus. Scientists, doctors, international institutions, Bill Gates, etc., all want it distributed without recourse to national ability to pay. They have, in some respects, the whip hand, don't they? A model for transnational morality, the ability to overcome national politics, or actually, is it perfectly moral for national leaders to look after their own in the first instance?
Great questions, both of them. China is not going to have the same values regarding how they interpret human rights, for example, as the US does. So when people talk about a liberal international order, they have to distinguish two aspects. One is the domestic human rights aspects. And there, I think it's simply a fact that you're going to have differences of what human rights mean in the two cultures. That doesn't mean you can't have a rules-based system which is related to international institutions. So if you ask, can we have a framework like the Paris Framework on Climate? Can we have a World Trade Organization? Can we have a World Health Organization? There are ways in which you could find a common interest between China and the US on the institutional part of the international order, even if they're going to have to agree to disagree on the human rights values. On the question of vaccines and how they should be distributed and so forth, I've written op-eds saying, imagine that Trump had taken the position on the question of pandemics and vaccines that Truman took with the Marshall Plan. Instead of saying it's either or, suppose we'd said, we can transform the world by creating an international COVID defense fund for poor countries. And we'll do it partly out of humanitarian interest, partly out of self-interest. If the poor countries become a reservoir for second, third, and fourth waves of the virus, that's bad for us. If we can make a major Marshall Plan for helping them afford these new vaccines and other aspects of a COVID defense fund, that's good for them. It's good for us, just the way the Marshall Plan was good for us and good for them. So it goes back to this point that I make in the book, which is, it's not do you defend your national interest, it's how do you define your national interest? And that's where the role for morality comes in.
Joe, I think on that very hopeful, as you might put it, liberal realist note, we're gonna leave it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a great pleasure to have the opportunity to listen to Joe Nye today. A lot of food for thought here. I know we didn't get to every question. All I can say is they've been preserved for posterity, those questions, and we'll send them to Joe. Joe, on behalf of the LSE, I want to thank you for taking time today to share your thoughts about about America's future, and that it really could not come at a more critical moment. To everybody else out there, to Mick and to Leslie, thank you very much for joining us, and to everybody, stay healthy, stay safe, take care.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Joe. Thank you.
Thanks, and nice to be back at LSE.
Good to have you back. Good to have you back.